There is a tower at the edge of the known world that no map will show you. Not because cartographers forgot it. Because every king who ever tried to claim it turned back. Some say the air around it bites. Some say the stone itself repels. The truth, well, the truth is stranger than fear, and we'll get there. But first, you need to understand what was living inside it. His name was Aurelio, and the first thing you'd notice about him, before his face, before his voice, before anything else, was the hair. Long silver gold. The kind of light that doesn't make sense indoors, like it carried its own sun. Fell past his knees. It moved when he moved, like something alive. He'd spent years trying to figure out why it wouldn't stop growing, why it seemed to breathe, why birds would land near the window just to be close to it. He had no answer. What he had instead was a woman, Mother Gothel, who smiled too wide when she looked at him, who called him her boy the way you'd call something yours. She told him he was a beta, unremarkable biologically speaking, low scent, low status, no particular value in a world that sorted people by designation the way merchants sorted grain. She told him he was lucky she kept him, that out there, in that brutal world of warring alphas and dwindling resources, a quiet little beta with pretty hair would be eaten alive. He believed her. He'd believed her for 22 years. That's the thing about a cage built from language. You don't see the bars. You just stop walking toward the door. Now, the world outside that tower, Omegas were extinct, or not extinct, gone, suppressed. A generation of political violence and biological manipulation had rendered them so rare that most people alive had never seen one in heat, never smelled that particular scent, couldn't even identify it if it passed them on the street. The Omegaverse had restructured itself around their absence. Alpha hierarchies became brutal without the biological anchor that once balanced them. Wars were messier. Bloodlines were fought over differently. The idea of an Omega carrier, a male Omega capable of bearing an heir naturally, had become the stuff of legend. Religious texts, whispered prophecy. And at the center of this world, sitting on a throne built from the ruins of 7 conquered kingdoms, was King Mordane. He was not a man who inspired poetry. He inspired compliance. The kind that happens when you've watched him end a war in 3 days flat and walk off the battlefield with blood on his jaw and no particular expression on his face. Battle-scarred from the left temple down through the neck. A gift from an assassination attempt he survived by sheer, insulting stubbornness. He ran his kingdom the way you'd run a military campaign. Efficiently, without sentiment, with an absolute intolerance for anything that didn't serve a function. He did not believe in love. He believed in leverage. And the tower, that tower, sat directly on the northern trade pass his enemies had been using for 6 years to move weapons and supply lines past his borders. Whoever held it held the pass. And Mordane had decided, with no particular ceremony, that he would hold it. He just didn't know what was already living inside. He broke in on a gray morning. Not dramatically. No battering ram. No speech. He climbed. Alone, because he did most things alone, because he trusted the competence of exactly 3 people in his life and none of them were invited on this particular errand. He found the window. He hauled himself over the ledge. And Aurelio hit him in the face with a cast iron pan. Which, in fairness, was the correct response. A man appearing through your window unannounced deserves exactly that. The problem was it didn't work. Mordane barely flinched, caught the pan on the backswing, looked at Aurelio with those cold, flat eyes like he was recalculating something, and said, "Stop." Just that. Aurelio stopped. Not because he was weak, but because something in that voice landed in his chest like a stone in still water, and his body, his stupid, confused body, went very, very quiet in a way it never had before. He would think about that for weeks. Mordane took in the tower methodically. The room, the exits, the sight lines. Last, he looked at Aurelio. The hair, the face, the wide-eyed stillness of him, the faint scent that was almost nothing. Almost beta-neutral, like warm wood and something just barely underneath. Like the suggestion of a smell rather than a smell itself. "Beta?" he said. Not a question. A categorization. "Yes." Aurelio said. Mordane nodded once. Then you're not useful to me. But you're not in my way either. Stay out of my soldier's path and you can remain. And that was it. That was the whole negotiation. Aurelio became a kept thing. Not a prisoner with chains, not a guest with courtesy, but something in between. A fixture of the tower that the new occupant had decided wasn't worth removing. He told himself he wasn't humiliated. He was absolutely humiliated. The soldiers came and went. The tower became a military outpost. And Mordane, King Mordane, conqueror of 7 kingdoms, a man with 10,000 people who answered to him, kept coming back to the room. Not to see Aurelio. That would be too simple a story. He came because the tower's upper chamber had the best strategic view of the pass. He spread his maps there. He worked there in silence, and Aurelio, who had nowhere else to go, was simply present. Existing in the corner with a book he'd already read 4 times. Moving around the edges of the room carefully, the way you move around something that might bite. The first time Mordane spoke to him unprompted was 9 days in. You're not afraid of me. Aurelio looked up. I am, he said, completely honestly. I'm just also bored. Fear is hard to sustain at a constant level. Something shifted in Mordane's face. Not quite a smile. More like recognition. Like a man who had never considered that response as a possibility and found it mildly interesting. That was how it started. Not romance. Not attraction. Conversation that happened against both their wills because they were trapped in the same space and one of them was curious by nature and the other was, underneath the armor he'd welded to himself over 35 years, desperately, quietly lonely. Aurelio talked too much when he was nervous. So he talked constantly and Mordane listened, and somewhere in the 3rd week Aurelio realized the king wasn't just tolerating the noise, he was leaning into it. Asking short, clipped questions just to hear the long, unspooling answers. Staying later than his work required. Why are you still here? Aurelio asked one night. It wasn't an accusation. Just genuine bafflement. Mordane looked at him for a long moment. I don't know, he said, and walked out. He was back the next morning. And then the smell changed. It happened slowly enough that Mordane almost missed it. Almost. But he was an alpha, and alphas notice scent the way the rest of the world notices weather. Something in the air of that room had shifted. The almost nothing of Aurelio's scent was becoming something warmer, deeper. Like the wood warmth that had always been there had found a fire underneath it. And the smoke was rising, and the smoke was sweet. Mordane said nothing. Aurelio noticed nothing, which was strange, because what Mordane was beginning to smell was something he had no living reference point for, something he'd only read about in old military intelligence files in historical accounts. It was faint, but it was unmistakable to the oldest part of his brain, the animal architecture underneath the king and the general and the man who didn't believe in sentiment. It was Omega. He left early that night. Stood outside in the cold air for a long time doing nothing in particular. Because if he was right, and he was very rarely wrong about anything his instincts told him, then either Aurelio had been lying to him for weeks, or Aurelio had no idea what he was. And neither scenario made any sense. The heat came on a Wednesday. Aurelio didn't know what was happening to him. He'd had fevers before, but not like this. Not the kind that came with a low ache in his spine and a sudden, disorienting sensitivity to everything. Sound was too loud. Light was too much. And the smell, Mordane's smell, which had always been there, wood smoke and iron and something dark and certain, was suddenly everywhere, like it had soaked into the walls, and his skin was doing something entirely unreasonable in response to it. He told himself he was sick. He barricaded the door. He lasted 4 hours before the heat crested into something he could not manage with willpower. He doesn't fully remember sending the message. He remembers writing it. He remembers that he wrote "come back" and then stared at it for a long time and almost tore it up, and then didn't because his hands weren't entirely his anymore. Mordane came back. He opened the door, walked in, stopped. The scent hit him like a physical force. Full-bloom Omega heat. True heat. The real thing, not a simulation, not ancient magic. pouring off Aurelio like heat off summer stone. Mordane's alpha instincts did not ask for permission. They simply answered the way a compass answers north, immediate and total and without apology. But Mordane was not an animal. He'd spent 35 years making sure of that. So he stood very still in the doorway and looked at Aurelio, who was sitting on the floor against the wall because the bed had become too much, hair pooled around him like silver water, eyes glassy and dark and fixed on Mordane with something that was half fear and half something that had no name for people who'd only ever been beta. "Tell me your name," Mordane said, quietly. "You know my name. Tell me anyway." "Aurelio. Aurelio." He said it like he was learning it properly for the first time. Then, very carefully, he crossed the room and lowered himself to the floor. Not looming, not claiming, just level with him. Eye to eye. "Are you afraid?" "Yes," Aurelio said. "But not of you. I'm afraid of what's happening to me." And Mordane, king, conqueror, the man who didn't believe in softness, said, "I know what's happening. I'll explain everything. But I need you to tell me if you want me to go." Aurelio looked at him for a long time. "Don't go," he said. What happened that night was not a transaction. That's the thing that neither of them had language for afterward. And both of them spent weeks trying to pretend had been something simpler than it was. Mordane was careful. Devastatingly, unexpectedly careful. Like a man who had been rough with everything his whole life and had suddenly, without warning, found something he was terrified of breaking. He kept asking, kept checking. Not in the clumsy way of someone performing consideration, but in the quiet way of someone genuinely uncertain, genuinely unwilling to assume. And Aurelio, who had spent 22 years being told he was unremarkable, was completely undone by being asked. Not just the heat, not just the biology that had suddenly rewritten itself underneath his skin. The way Mordane's hands, scarred, blunt, the hands of a man who had ended lives with them, moved through his hair like it was something sacred, like he was afraid it would disappear, like he'd been wanting to do that since the first day in this room and had been fighting it every hour since. "You should have told me," Mordane said at some point in the dark. "Told you what?" "I didn't know." A long silence. "I know." "Then why do you sound angry?" He didn't answer right away. And when he did, it came out rougher than he probably intended. Like something he'd been holding compressed for a long time had gotten too big for the container. "Because I've been sitting in this room with you for 3 weeks trying not to." He stopped. Jaw tight. "Not to what?" Aurelio asked. Soft. "Not to want something I have no right to want." That was a lot. From a man whose full vocabulary for vulnerability was a 3-second silence and a slight tightening around the eyes. Aurelio understood it, though, completely, because he'd been doing the same thing from the other direction. Talking too much, filling every silence, convincing himself that the way this man's presence rearranged his thoughts was nothing more than the strangeness of the situation. They were both, it turned out, terrible liars. The night moved around them. Mordane was not gentle in the way that weakness is gentle. He was gentle in the way that strength chooses to be, deliberate, specific, every touch a decision. And Aurelio met him the way water meets land, with a total, unashamed willingness that he didn't think about and couldn't have explained. His new biology was part of it. His heat was real and urgent and it wanted what it wanted. But underneath the heat was something that had been building for 3 weeks in the quiet of a shared room. Something that had nothing to do with designation. The way Mordane looked at him when he thought Aurelio wasn't watching. The way he'd started leaving an extra lamp burning without explanation. The way, and this was the one that had stuck, the way 2 weeks in, Aurelio had fallen asleep over his book and woken up with someone else's cloak laid over his shoulders, and Mordane already back at his maps, not looking up, offering absolutely no comment. Aurelio had pressed his face into that cloak for a moment when he thought no one was watching. He suspected now that someone had been watching. The heat broke near dawn. They lay in the strange, stunned quiet of it. Outside, the past was gray and empty. Aurelio's hair was everywhere, tangled with both of them, because that was simply the reality of that much hair and that small a space. Mordane didn't move away. He lay there like a man who had made a decision he hadn't fully processed yet, one arm behind his head, staring at the ceiling. "Everything's different now," he said finally. Aurelio didn't ask what things. He already knew. The whole world had changed sometime in the last 9 hours, and neither of them were the same people who'd walked into it. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew yet, was that the change had already gone further than either of them realized. Mordane left before sunrise. He always left before sunrise. Aurelio told himself this wasn't a wound. It was absolutely a wound. But here is where the story gets complicated. Because Mordane, riding back through his kingdom with his generals, his campaigns, his cold practicality. Mordane was not the same man who had climbed that tower weeks ago. He was distracted, clipped in meetings in a way that was different from his usual clipped. He sent supply convoys to the tower that were far more generous than military necessity required. Warm things, food that wasn't rations. Once, a box of books that arrived with no note and required no explanation. He told himself it was logistics. His generals knew better and had the survival instinct not to say so. And then he came back. Not for the pass. The pass could manage itself for 1 week. He came back, and the moment he stepped into that room and Aurelio looked up at him with that expression. That specific expression, like he'd been waiting but hadn't let himself admit it. Mordane crossed the room in 4 steps and kissed him like a man who had been furious with himself the entire ride home for wanting to. No preamble. No speech. Aurelio laughed against his mouth. "You missed me," he said. "I don't miss people." And yet, Mordane pulled back just enough to look at him. Properly look, the way he looked at a map or a battlefield. Reading everything, missing nothing. "You're different," he said. Aurelio frowned. "I feel different. I thought it was the heat, still lingering. But it's not the heat." Something in his voice made Aurelio go still. Mordane's face had done something complicated. Not the controlled blankness he wore in council chambers. Something raw. Something that looked like a man standing at the edge of something enormous and not entirely sure if it was a cliff or a gate. He didn't say what he suspected. Not yet. But Aurelio saw it in his face. And the fear that coiled quietly in his gut from that moment onward, that specific, formless, "something is happening to my body that I don't understand" fear, would be the thing that drove the next 2 months. Let's talk about the pregnancy. Because the first thing Mordane did when confirmation was no longer possible to avoid, and this is the part that makes you love him and hate him in exactly equal measure, was pull back. Not leave. Not cruelty. Worse, distance. The cold, deliberate kind. He came to the tower and he was there in body and absent in every other way. He watched Aurelio with eyes that Aurelio couldn't read, and the warmth that had started building in those long evenings over maps and books contracted into something watchful and clinical. Aurelio, who was already frightened, who was already navigating a body that was becoming something he'd never been prepared for, who was already grieving the woman he was starting to understand had lied to him his entire life. Aurelio had exactly one resource in that tower, and that resource had gone cold. He didn't rage. He didn't plead. He looked at Mordane one night, when the silence had become genuinely unbearable, and said, "If you're going to accuse me of something, do it. I'm tired of being tried in a court I can't see." Mordane was quiet for a long time. "There are people who know old magic," he said finally, "who could mimic an Omega's biology, strategically, to produce an heir with a king's blood and create a claim on the throne." The silence after that was a different kind of silence. "You think I did this on purpose?" Aurelio said. "I think it's possible. I thought I was a beta my whole life. I didn't know what I was until it happened in front of you. The woman who raised me could have designed exactly this situation." Aurelio stood up. His hair swung. His hands, Mordane noticed, were very steady. "Then leave," he said. "If I am what you think I am, you're in danger here. Leave." He didn't leave, which told Aurelio something he filed away and held onto through the months that followed like a torch in a dark corridor. Mordane did not actually believe his own accusation. He was afraid. The most powerful alpha in 7 kingdoms was afraid, not of a conspiracy, not of an enemy's scheme, but of what it meant if this was real. Of what it meant that he'd spent 3 weeks sitting in this room finding reasons to stay. Of what it would cost him to care about something that could be taken. He had lost things before. He had stopped allowing himself things so that he couldn't lose them. Aurelio was a thing that had happened to him before he could stop it. So they moved through those months in a strange, specific tension that was neither together nor apart. Mordane was there constantly, more than military necessity required, more than he had any logistical reason to explain to his generals. He was there and he was careful and he was attentive in all the practical ways, ensuring Aurelio had everything he needed, monitoring the pregnancy with a thoroughness that could only be read as fear disguised as due diligence, and he would not touch him. Not once after that night. Aurelio, for his part, had stopped pushing. He'd found a different kind of strength in the months of physical change. Something quieter, more rooted. He was not the same person who had hit an intruding king with a pan and spent 22 years believing a woman who called him her boy. He was discovering, slowly, that he was not unremarkable. He was not a beta who got lucky. He was something that hadn't existed in this world for decades, and the fact that he was still standing, still coherent, still capable of laughing in this man's general direction, that was not weakness. That was something else entirely. And Mordane watched this becoming, this person who had every right to fall apart choosing deliberately not to, and fell the rest of the way in love like a man stepping off a ledge he'd been standing on the edge of for months. He still said nothing. Of course he said nothing. The labor started at dawn on the 58th day of the 9th month. There is no elegant version of this part of the story. This is the part you need to understand not as drama but as stakes, real, physical, specific stakes. Aurelio's body had only been Omega for months. The biological architecture required to survive an Omega birth, the particular flexibility, the years of hormonal preparation was not there. It had never been built. He had a beta's pelvis. He had a beta's pain tolerance thresholds for this type of event, which is to say, insufficient. He knew this. The healer knew this. Mordane's face, when the healer told him quietly in the corridor, went through something complicated and landed somewhere that looked like grief. What are the outcomes? He asked. Flat. Controlled. The healer did not sugarcoat it. She gave him numbers. Probabilities. Mordane listened to all of it and nodded once and walked back into the room. Aurelio looked at him from the bed. He was already exhausted, and it had barely started. How bad? He asked. Bad, Mordane said, because he had decided, somewhere in the corridor, that Aurelio had earned the truth. Okay, Aurelio said. He reached out his hand. Mordane stood there for a second. Just a second. The king of 7 kingdoms, the man who had walked off a battlefield with a near-fatal wound and made a tactical decision on the way to the physician. Just standing there, looking at an outstretched hand, and visibly, quietly breaking. He took it. He did not let go for 3 days. There is something that happens to a person when they sit with someone through something like that. When there is nothing to do, no strategy, no leverage, no opponent to outmaneuver, and the only thing between you and catastrophe is staying, and staying is the only thing you can do. Mordane stayed. He stayed through the first night when Aurelio's body simply refused to cooperate with what was being asked of it, and the pain was the specific, grinding kind that is neither dramatic nor bearable. He stayed when Aurelio, delirious toward the end of the second night, grabbed his wrist and said, I know what you thought. I know you thought I was lying. I need you to know I wasn't. And Mordane, who was not a man who knelt easily, leaned down and said very quietly, close enough that it wasn't for anyone else in the room, I know. I knew before I said it. I was afraid. That's not an excuse. But I need you to know that I knew. Aurelio looked at him with eyes that were very tired and very clear. Then stay afraid, he said. Just don't go. I'm not going. The third morning was when the crisis peaked. The healer said what she had to say. Mordane's generals outside the tower door heard what they heard. Not the words but the tone, and his most senior commander, who had served him for 15 years and had never once seen him visibly shaken, watched him walk out of that room for air and stand against the stone wall with his head back and his eyes closed and his jaw tight enough to break. The commander said nothing. Nobody said anything. He went back in. When it was over, and it was over with both of them alive, which was not a certainty anyone had been operating under. The room was very quiet. The healer stepped back. The child made the noise that newborns make, this astonishing, furious announcement of their own existence, and Aurelio made a sound that wasn't words, and Mordane, who was still holding his hand, who had been holding his hand for 3 days, looked down at the thing in the healer's hands like a man who had never seen anything real before in his life. He sat on the edge of the bed. The healer placed the child on Aurelio's chest. Mordane looked at Aurelio, who was looking at the child, who had this expression: exhausted, wrecked, undone, luminous. Mordane reached out and pushed the hair back from Aurelio's face. Very carefully. The way you touch something you've almost lost. I owe you an apology, he said. A real one. Not now. You need to sleep. But a real one. Aurelio turned his head and looked at him. I know, he said. And then, you stayed. Yes. That's, he stopped, too tired for the full sentence. That's the beginning of it. Mordane understood. The apology was a beginning, not an ending. The trust had to be built. The distance he'd chosen when he was afraid had to be answered with something more than presence in a crisis. He knew that. He was not, in the end, a man who needed things explained twice. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead against Aurelio's temple. Stayed there. Not a kiss. Something more elemental than a kiss. Just contact, just I am here, I choose this, I am not leaving. Aurelio closed his eyes. Outside the tower, dawn was happening. The past was quiet. The kingdom existed in its vast, complicated, ongoing way, full of politics and power and all the things that Mordane was supposed to be attending to with his full and undivided attention. Let it wait. Here is what history would later say about the king and the man in the tower. It would be clinical, formal. It would note the unprecedented biological event, the political implications of the heir's birth, the resolution of the Northern Pass conflict. It would categorize, arrange, make it tidy in the way that history is always tidy in retrospect, stripping out the 3 weeks of evenings over maps and books, the cloak left without comment. The letters that passed between them in the months after that contained approximately 40% military logistics and 60% conversation that had nothing to do with anything except two people who had found, against every structural disadvantage of their situation, something worth saying to each other. History would not record the pan. The pan deserves to be recorded. History would not record what Mordane looked like sitting on a stone floor with his back against the wall and a beta turned omega talking at him for 3 hours about the behavior of birds near the north window. Not because he was required to listen, but because something in the room had felt, for the first time in longer than he could name, like home. History would not record that the most feared alpha in 7 kingdoms was brought to his knees not by an army, not by a political maneuver, not by anything he could have anticipated or defended against, but by an outstretched hand in a dark room and the choice to take it. Some stories are too human for the history books. This one happened anyway. And somewhere, in a tower that no map will show you, a window is open. The hair moves in the breeze. The child sleeps. The king is, unusually, not where his generals expect him to be. He is exactly where he decided to be, which, in the end, is the whole story.
If you loved this video, show me some support by subscribing and clicking the notification bell.